All right, it's 2 o'clock, so I'm going to start the broadcast and we'll begin. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it just another minute here while people get settled and get logged on, and then we'll get started. Okay, it looks like we have a full house today. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us today for another NACDA webinar. My name is Dana Leroy. I'm the Communications Manager for NACDA. If you've tuned into one of our sessions over the last few weeks, welcome back. If this is your first NACDA webinar session, we're glad you're with us, and we hope we leave you with some valuable takeaways for your athletics department. We thought it would be a good time today to provide some legal focused content, and many of you shared the same feelings in your suggestions. So today we are proud to present COVID-19 and college athletics, cost containment and legal landmines with Dan Cohen and Cheryl Levick. Dan is the leader of the higher education team at the law firm of Nelson Mullins. He exclusively represents universities in their legal compliance matters with a focus on Title IX. He has been working with universities and their athletics departments on Title IX issues for about 20 years. Before working for athletics departments, Dan worked in athletics departments, including Duke, Florida, South Florida, and Vanderbilt. He's also appointed by 2 states to represent their university systems in Title IX and other legal compliance matters. Cheryl is the founder of the Personalized Executive Training Program and Collegiate Athletics Consulting Services. Her expertise lies in Title IX reviews, strategic planning, personnel evaluations, organizational structure, and program reviews. She has 35 years of hands-on collegiate athletics administration experience, including 12 years as a director of athletics at 3 Division I institutions. And while we are disappointed that we won't be able to recognize her properly in person in Las Vegas this year, we are proud that Cheryl is a member of the NACDA Hall of Fame class of 2020. Before we begin, for our live attendees, we encourage you to ask questions during the webinar using the Q&A feature within the Zoom window. We will have a lot of time for questions with Dan and Cheryl after the presentation. This live stream is also being broadcast on NACDA's YouTube channel. So for those of you who might have colleagues who were not able to join via Zoom, they can still tune into the live session by going to youtube.com/ADNACDA. As a reminder, a recording of this webinar will, as well as the presentation slides, will be made available to all registrants via email, as well as all NACDA and affiliates members via the NACDA Daily Review. And with that, I will kick it over to Dan and Cheryl to take it away.
Dana, thank you so much. Dan and I are delighted to spend the next hour with you. Dan and I have worked together over the last 5 years and have worked with many of you that are on this call today. So athletic directors, FARs, SWAs, general counsel, presidents. We are delighted to be able to share the next 60 minutes to really talk about what's facing us today and see if we can help you in some way by the end of this session. Dan?
All right. Well, thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Dana, and thank you, NACDA, for this opportunity. We're happy to share some thoughts with you here today. This is going to be our agenda. It's ambitious, but we're going to try to move through it quickly so that we have time for questions, possibly during this presentation, but more likely at the end. So as Dana said, please do use the questions feature in order to submit questions that come up. So our agenda, we're going to, as I said, we'll try to move through quickly. We're going to start with kind of the COVID-19 reality for college athletics departments in this day and age. We'll walk through possible sport and staff reductions. Unfortunately, that's something that many of you are at least considering, some of you are facing. And then we're going to talk about cost containment and Title IX compliance matters. So that really has to do with how do you provide equitable treatment while you're anticipating decreasing travel expenses, decreasing support services, or taking other measures. We're then going to turn to spring sports scholarship changes. As we had our spring sports canceled this last year, what does that mean based on the NCAA waivers going into spring of 21? And lastly, like I said, we're going to try to save some time for Q&A. If we don't get to your specific question, either of us are happy to talk with you offline afterwards. Sometimes that approach is just better for questions that may be narrow to your institution. But really, we do encourage you to reach out if there's something that comes to mind. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cheryl for the COVID-19 reality for college athletics.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, clearly, everybody on this call knows that the reality for college athletics and COVID-19 is incredibly challenging. And this is not a time for a slash and dash kind of cost-cutting measure and planning. Instead, it's really something we need to look at from a systematic and very resourceful approach. With the disruption of schedules, competitions, we thrive on large gatherings, obviously. It really has hurt every aspect of our departments on every divisional level. You know, in addition to that, we have institutions in different states that are in the same conference with different restrictions, and to try to plan for next year has become really, really cumbersome. I spent the last couple of days really just reaching out to my colleagues around the nation, talking to athletic directors and commissioners about how they're doing this, and we'll share more of that later on as we go through the session. But it is so cumbersome to try to put it all together because of the varying differences from state to state and conference to conference. And we all know right now there's continuous spread of this virus. We thrive on face-to-face gatherings. We thrive on having one ball and 50 people handling the one ball. We also know now that as a result of that, we are devastated with the implications of loss of income, ticket sales, student fees, operating budgets, and fundraising. So never has there been a more important time for you all to have your crisis management plan in place, and it's embedded within your strategic plan as well as your Title IX plan. And all of those plans must be integral to your play right now. You must be really smart that your solutions today are not creating additional problems tomorrow. And by that, I mean Title IX problems or Title VII problems. It's really important that you're strategic as well as resourceful as you go through the cuts this spring, layoffs, furloughs, temporary closing of things, and moving on to the reality of what it might look like in FY21. We must hold true to the mission. You must hold true to the true values and what's in the best interest of the student athletes with every decision. And that's hard. We know, because we're panicking when we know we need to cut 20% of our operating budget, but you cannot set aside, and that's what Dan and I are going to help you with today, that when you do this, you must have equity in the back of your mind at all times to make sure that you're being fair to the student athletes, to the coaches, to your department all the way through.
All right, so I'll jump in here, and we thought we would start with one of the hardest things that some of you may be facing, the possibility of sport reductions. Nobody wants to be in that situation, but in today's budgetary reality, sometimes that is something that you have to face. And so we're going to start really with a legal foundation. Each one of these sections, we're probably going to start on the legal foundation so you know where those legal landmines might be. So when we're talking about the potential for sport reductions, we're really talking about decreasing participation opportunities, and that is governed by federal law. So under Title IX, you must provide equitable participation opportunities, and that's measured by the three-prong test. Probably all of you are familiar with that, but just really quick recap. Prong one involves proportionality, where your male and female student athlete ratio is comparable to your undergraduate ratio, male to females. Prong two really is about making progress towards proportionality. Are you expanding opportunities for the underrepresented gender? And then prong three involves if you can demonstrate that you are fully and effectively accommodating the athletic interests and abilities of the underrepresented gender. And I'm giving this foundation because as we're now contemplating the possibility of reducing teams or reducing sports, usually, now there are some creative approaches available, but usually you need to comply with prong one afterwards if you are contemplating eliminating opportunities for the underrepresented gender. So let me take a step back and explain why that is. So if at most of your campuses, women are the underrepresented gender, if you, under prong two, you're supposed to be increasing opportunities for the underrepresented gender for women. If you're taking away women's athletic opportunities, decreasing teams, you're really moving in the opposite direction of prong two. Similarly with prong 3, if you're supposed to be fully and effectively accommodating the athletic interests and abilities of your student athletes, well, if your student athletes were interested in a team yesterday, they're probably still interested in a team tomorrow. So generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, you become disqualified from prong 3 if you eliminate a team for the underrepresented gender. So what does that mean? It means that typically if you're cutting teams on both sides, you must comply with prong 1 afterwards. So, okay, that's what I just said. Generally, you must comply with prong 1 afterwards. So we wanted to spend some time talking about whether or not that's practical for a lot of you.
I mean, Dan, seriously, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So I'm going to kind of play the devil's advocate against the attorney here. I mean, does anyone care about this during a pandemic? Is OCR really going to look? I mean, talk to us about, we are in crisis mode here. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very valid concern. And it's certainly something, you know, both you and I have heard from athletic directors and athletic departments over the last several weeks. I just want to emphasize here, it is really easy for someone to file a legal complaint against your school, whether that's through the Office for Civil Rights, whether that's through a plaintiff's attorney. I mean, we've seen a lot of that recently. The plaintiff's attorneys are hungry right now. But setting that aside, will OCR give you more leeway today than they did a year ago? Yes, probably, but we've actually prepared a number of kind of case studies because this happens every single economic downturn. Every single, you know, time we face dire straits like this, after 2008, you know, back in the 1990s, every time schools eliminate programs, eliminate teams for the underrepresented gender, every time there are complaints, and pretty much every time schools get reversed. So that's what we wanted to kind of walk through with some of these case studies. You know, sometimes you're just desperate financially, so you got to do what you got to do. Sometimes, though, it's just a matter of making a mistake and not understanding the full legal foundation that underlies what implications these decisions have for you. So we don't want you to walk into a situation where you cut a team and then have that reversed by a court or by OCR, and then you end up spending more money than you thought you were saving from doing so. This has been the case easy in the public purview since the 1990s, the famous Brown University case. Anybody who studied Title IX knows about that. But there were several others in the 90s, including Peterson versus LSU, which forced LSU to add its softball team and also resulted in monetary sanctions against the school. But there's been several others. And I just wanted to give you a couple of samples here, really across all NCAA divisions. This is not a Division I problem. This is not a small school problem. It affects private schools. It affects public schools. We wanted to give you a couple of case studies here. So this first one involves a D2 school. In 2016, they announced plans to eliminate 6 teams, including 4 men's teams and 2 women's teams due to budgetary pressures. Obviously, these cuts were going to fall heavier on the men's side, but the problem was that the school was not in compliance with prong 1 prior to the cuts and was not projected to comply with prong 1 after the cuts. So once this lawsuit came, the judge granted a preliminary injunction that reinstated women's tennis. I should say women were the underrepresented gender. So women, as the underrepresented gender, filed the lawsuit. The court granted a preliminary injunction reinstating the women's tennis team. Later on, the other women's team was also reinstated. Eventually, the judge certified this as a class action on behalf of basically all present, prospective, and future female students at the university who were harmed by and want to end the university's sex discrimination. Pretty broad statement there. Eventually, as this case played out, the court did in fact find that the school was in violation with Title IX. Of course, throughout all of this, the school is still facing tremendous budgetary pressures. They ended up cutting their football program as well as another men's program in order to try to make up not just the original budgetary shortfall, but now they're also paying legal fees out of pocket. They were ordered to pay $1.17 million to cover the plaintiff's attorney's fees because the plaintiffs were the prevailing party in this litigation. And then they also were forced to face contempt motions because they couldn't get to a point of compliance that satisfied the court. Meanwhile, they had plaintiff's attorneys coming after them the whole time. So one, kind of emergency cut at the beginning that fell across that Title IX line led to all of these later legal ramifications. But, this is not an exception. This is often the case. So here's another example in 2018 where this is a Division I school that eliminated 4 teams, again with the men bearing the brunt of the cuts. However, women were the underrepresented gender before the cuts, and they were projected to still be the underrepresented gender after the cuts. So in this litigation, again, the judge granted a preliminary injunction that reinstated one team. Eventually, it was certified as a class action. Eventually, the judge found that the school was in violation of Title IX. And while this school was not ordered to reinstate the second women's team, it was required to replace those female athletic opportunities with other opportunities. And then eventually they were required to come out of pocket for a substantial amount of money. So they ended up having to effectively reverse their early cuts, pay money to the plaintiffs, pay more money to actually reach a point of compliance after the judge ruled that they had not been in compliance initially. I'll try to pick up some speed here. I don't want to get too bogged down in the case studies. Really, the point is there's a lot of them. And you'll have access to this PowerPoint afterwards. Here's another one that I included because it's unique in the sense that instead of going through the court system, this involved a complaint filed with the Federal Office for Civil Rights. So no plaintiffs and attorneys that were involved. There was no discovery process. Once OCR receives a well-founded complaint, they are statutorily required to investigate. And so here was a situation where the school was not in compliance with prong one prior to the cuts. And even though they cut two equal sized teams, just because the teams were the same size or even more men were cut, it still resulted in a situation where those cuts were, legally speaking, not deep enough. Women remained the underrepresented gender at a time where women's opportunities were decreasing. So that was a legal problem. OCR eventually forced this university to enter into a resolution agreement where they had to reach prong one. They had to increase participation opportunities. They had to add a women's soccer team. So, again, you have a lot of these types of situations. One other note on this one, an external assessment. The school hired a non-attorney consultant to try to help them work through this issue. And the non-attorney consultant said, yeah, you've got Title IX issues. But because the consultant was not an attorney, that work ended up being discoverable. It was subject to an open records request and ultimately was used against the school as almost an admission that they had issues. So be very careful. These are fundamentally issues of compliance with federal law. And so if you're trying to get a legal opinion, you want to use lawyers where you have the benefit of the attorney-client privilege to protect those documents or those internal deliberations in a way that a non-attorney consultant cannot protect you simply because they don't have the advantage of the attorney-client privilege. So that was another reason to include this case study.
Hey,
The
Dan.
last one, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but here's one more where the school, this was a private Division I school in 2009, so the last big economic downturn. This one was unique because the school actually was projected to comply with prong one after it cut certain programs, 2 men's teams and 1 women's team. But the court ultimately disagreed with the way that the school was planning to make these cuts, challenged the validity of the plans. And so the court held against the school. This litigation played out over several years, was very, very expensive in the form of attorney's fees. And ultimately, as you see on the slide, the school was forced to spend at least $5 million improving facilities used by women's teams. It was required to increase other categories of annual spending on women's teams, et cetera. So you think you're actually solving a budgetary problem by cutting teams, but if it results in a violation of Title IX, or it exacerbates an already existing Title IX non-compliant situation, you could find yourself actually spending a whole lot more money to rectify that situation. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom. There are some good examples. There are ways that you can do this. There are creative approaches available. And this is something that we do, right? We're, as lawyers, and Cheryl is, working with us under our attorney-client privilege umbrella, we can come up with strategies that do pass legal challenge. So here's one in 2017, a year after eliminating baseball, a state university cut 2 women's teams and 1 men's team. The female student athletes sued, but the thing is that following the elimination of baseball the year before, women were actually the overrepresented gender at this school. So once the women's teams were cut in the second iteration, the school did comply with prong one. Their opportunities for men and women were balanced. And this was done without, dramatically changing roster sizes or anything like that. All of their roster projections were pretty much on par with where they historically had been. So this is, it's always painful to cut teams. From a legal standpoint, this was a success story. The court dismissed the plaintiff's complaint on the pleadings. OCR also received 2 complaints. OCR dismissed both of those inside of 6 months. You know, it's myopic to say that it's a success story just because they won in court and won with OCR. Of course, these are difficult decisions that none of us want to be making, but they did come out the other side successfully. And just real quick, there was one other that I wanted to bring to your attention before kind of trying to save us some time and moving on. But here was another one back in 2006 where a private university cut 10 teams, big cuts because of the budgetary pressures that they were under. 7 men's teams and 3 women's teams, the math added up, and they ended up complying with prong 1 after the program changes. Their athletic department was balanced. Ultimately, there was a lawsuit. And the court dismissed the plaintiff's complaint on the pleadings, and then the Court of Appeals affirmed the dismissal. So like I said before, there are ways to eliminate teams if you're forced to do that, that will pass legal scrutiny. And ultimately, you don't want to have your budgetary decisions reversed because of legal problems. So feel free to contact Cheryl or me afterwards. We're happy to talk through what might work on your campus. But just want to run you through a couple of these case studies quickly to show you that this is real. And to Cheryl's earlier kind of, devil's advocate question, people do still care. Those student athletes who are having opportunities eliminated, or those coaches who are having their jobs cut, they do care. They can sue you, and frankly, they can win depending on whether you've been careful and diligent legally to make sure that your cuts are compliant with the law.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
There's a good question that came in. I know we're going to hold most questions to the end, but it's pertinent right now. We might as well just tackle it because I know everybody's chomping at the bits to talk about this. Football. And basically the question is, given the economic importance of the game of football with television, ticket sales, and sponsorship, is there any likelihood as a result of this crisis that football not be counted towards Title IX? And should we, as an enterprise, go to the government and try to see if we could get it to change? So let's tackle the first part of it. Is there any way that football is not counted towards Title IX in a crisis?
I think there's no chance that football would not be counted towards Title IX in a crisis. Back in the mid 70s, so Title IX dates back to 1972. And the most formative regulations, particularly for athletics, came about in 1979, the policy interpretation. Now, there were some other federal regulations that came out in 1975, but as we had all these legal machinations in the 70s, there was an attempt, it was called the Tower Amendment, to try to exclude football because of the prominence of football, that there's no women's football program, there's no offset, there's no easy offset, I should say. And so there was a legislative attempt to exclude football from Title IX, and it resoundingly failed. And I think where we are in society today, with the Me Too movement, with all of the other, protections that we've seen success with through the years, I don't think there's any chance that football would be excluded under the law.
Good, that's what we need. People are asking it.
All right. But of course, that is the elephant in the room. I mean, I'm not ignoring it. I'm just saying, gosh, we do need to deal with it. And that's actually a nice segue here to talk about, okay, where do you guys stand? So we're talking about eliminating programs, which of course I know none of you want to do. It's like a last ditch effort to try to rectify really budgetary financial straits. So let's look at whether or not reaching prong 1 may be practical for you. Now, we've got a whole lot of people on the audience, a lot of schools. All I can do is offer you kind of the national Title IX compliance statistics. So these are self-reports. These are your own numbers that you reported on your EADA reports to the Department of Education last year. 1,078 NCAA schools self-reported on their EADA reports last year about their prong 1 compliance. And what we found is that only 11.5% of all schools were within 2% of proportionality for prong 1. Now, 2% is just kind of a rule of thumb. It's not a hard and fast rule. So particularly if we're talking about program changes here, I wanted to expand it a little bit to also look between, 2%, 5%. And we do find another chunk of schools that are reasonably close to that 2% metric. But as we move farther out, you see that women are the underrepresented gender at 72.6% of all reporting NCAA schools. And if we expand that to who has a double-digit gap, where are women underrepresented by more than 10%, it's 55.1% of all NCAA schools. So you can see why Title IX compliance is a problem nationally. And frankly, that was before the pandemic hit and exerted more budgetary pressure on athletic departments and created more issues. So, while we're looking at, actually, don't want to scare you here too much. I do want to clarify, it is completely practical for your school to comply with prong 2, prong 3. We do a ton of work with schools on prong 3 compliance. It is completely viable, it is reliable, but it requires proactivity. You have to be able to demonstrate that you're complying with Title IX. It requires annual data collection as well as that monitoring. So, I want to keep the presentation moving today. I'm happy to talk with you about that offline. The takeaway here really is, if you need to cut teams, make sure that you're not disqualifying yourself from prong 2 or prong 3 compliance, and make sure that you know where your Title IX numbers are and where you'll stand following the cuts. So like I said, feel free to use the chat feature or the question box. We're happy to answer questions now or otherwise offline. But at this point, let me turn it over to Cheryl.
Okay, Dan, before you turn it over to me, which I'm going to go right into staff reductions, there's another great question that you're on a roll. Let's keep you going for a second here. All right, so the question is really, we're hearing about sports suspension versus sports reduction. And if you look at suspending an Olympic sport for a year until we can correct the financial situation, they could honor scholarships, honor coaches. Isn't that still a Title IX issue?
Well, it is a Title IX issue because we're talking about different treatment for certain student athletes who are losing that opportunity to compete in 1 year. So there are definitely Title IX ramifications for doing that. But you're right, Cheryl, and the person who asked the question is right as well. There are different ways to view that, and it probably would survive a certain level of scrutiny from a prong 1 standpoint, but we really would need to dive in and figure out whether that treatment remains equitable for the team or teams that are facing this temporary suspension.
So whoever answered that, let me ask that, Derek. The answer is it sort of depends. You hate that answer, but maybe, but it really does depend on your situation and literally what your situation from a Title IX standpoint looked like before we walked into this crisis. Because if you were in good shape before you walked in, you have much more flexibility than if you were already off before you walked into this crisis.
That's exactly right.
Good. Okay. All righty. Dan, you want me to take, are we ready for sports staff reductions or no? Okay.
I think so.
Cool. Thank you. All right. Great questions, by the way. Keep them coming in and I'll try to monitor those as we go. If it's appropriate, I'll pop them in like I have been because we really want to be helpful. I know you guys are worried and stressed. Okay. So when you're looking at staff reductions, and again, I'm talking to a lot of folks on this webinar that have years and years and years of experience. So I'm not trying to, preach here, but I do want to reemphasize that you need to set up a systematic plan for your sport and sport and staff reductions, and that might include coaches reductions. It just depends, but it needs to be a systematic and consistent plan, and it needs to be communicated well. Where you get in trouble, guys, is if you say this is what you're going to do, and then you dodge left or dodged right because you've got a coach that voiced something too loudly. I can't get rid of my director of ops, or do not take away my specialized compliance person from me. So you dodge and dart because of pressure from folks on your, and particularly coaches. We all know that. Heck, we've all done that. So it's really important, I'm going to emphasize it again, that you and your staff develop a systematic, consistent plan for if you're doing staff reduction, if you're doing service reduction, if you're doing coaching reduction, that it's consistent, that it is equitable, and that you communicate it well, and then walk the talk. Do not start deviating from that unless it is a across the board deviation because you found more money. You found another pocket of money that you can save 3 positions because of that. So again, consistency, systematic planning is again, and effective communication goes without saying. Okay. So if you're looking at 2 years, and you're looking at FY20, we know that spring blew up. And so we're trying to figure out a way to balance that. And you're also trying to plan with a lot of unknowns for FY21, you really are looking at what can you do immediately and then what can you do long term. And a lot of folks that I talked to over the last 3 days are saying, Cheryl, we're really waiting until, the end of May, like June 1 is kind of our day. We're going to make a decision or find out some, because most of us start with a fiscal year of July 1st. And so we're trying to figure out short-term, long-term. So just as you do that, again, look at consistency. And here are some things that people are doing across the nation. A lot of folks are saying, you know what, and you've seen this because it's hit on the NACTA board all across the way, is a lot of the athletic directors, a lot of the higher end administrators are taking a voluntary cut. I think it's a very smart and sophisticated way to do it. Let's start there and then figure out how to maximize your staff and as well as getting to the number you need to get to from the budget cuts. Many people are saying, Cheryl, after the voluntary reductions, we are really looking at 10% across the board, and we are empowering our sport managers and our coaches to come up with the cuts where they want them. That's one good strategy. It's consistent. Another one said, Cheryl, we're not going to give it to the coach to decide. I need to make that decision, or my senior team needs to make that decision. And I am going to start with what do we need to maintain our core values and our mission statement and still service the student athletes. Might be at a much lower level, but it will definitely be fair and consistent. And they're saying, so we are eliminating anything that we feel is not needed. That might be all the staff that's in your nutritional bar area. I'm not advocating anything. I'm just sharing with you what a lot of people are saying. A lot of people are eliminating all part-time staff that are there to be able to save full-time staff. A lot of people are looking at, if I eliminate assistant coach from a men's sport, do I need to eliminate it from the women's sport? When you look at it from an equity standpoint, the answer will be, you got to do something there to make sure that it's fair. So I think you need to look at all of those options as you're going through that. When you're looking at sports services staff, again, it really is the servicing for the student athletes. And you'll hear Dan and I talk about, what do you really need to have a successful athletic program? Do we need, not that we're talking about equipment right now, but do we need that fourth uniform? Do we need, a lot of those assistants that we have added on over the years to be bigger, better, stronger, faster? We've all done it. We've been in the middle of it. It is time now to really look at, what does it take to still be successful? What does it look like? How can we get back to our basic budget needs, balance that budget, still run an effective program, still maintain high academic standards, but get to these budget numbers? And I think you'll see it's almost a reset button, people have said, to what it looked like, I don't know, 8, 10, 15 years ago. I'm not sure, you all tell me, where we didn't have a lot of the extras around, that we were able to go back to some of the basics. I've had a number of you that say over the past 3 days, Cheryl, when it came to psychological services, we know that, shoot, all of us need it right now in the middle of this pandemic, but we're really looking at, if we had an independent psychological services program, maybe we could merge with what the university's offering and be able to save money there. So they're looking at consolidation as opposed to elimination, which I think is really smart. When it comes to the training room, strength and conditioning, academics, a lot of folks are saying, Cheryl, I'm not going to touch my academics, but I'll push back and say, do you need specialized academic counselor per sport? Or can you pull it back in where you've got a group of counselors that are servicing all? Again, from an equity standpoint, I hear Dan's echoing in my ear here. Make sure that you're not giving all that support to football or the men's program and not the women's program, or vice versa, one way or the other. Make sure that that's equitable all the way through there. When it comes to, if you are eliminating coaches, we've talked about sports now, we've talked about staff now, but you're eliminating coaches. This is really where there's a bit of a sticky wicket when it comes to Title IX, and you're going to cross paths with some Title VII issues as well. So we need to be really careful when it comes to the coaches reduction, that you look at this through a Title IX lens, please. that, and you'll hear Dan talk about a sports strata a lot, where you're looking at, men's basketball, women's basketball, football against fall sports would be volleyball, women's soccer, whatever. You have a strata that you look at to make sure that if you're taking from one side, you're also taking from the other side as you go through it all. Title IX does not require us to do it in that way from sport to sport. It really does look at it from an aggregate, but you and I both know that if you're dropping a assistant coach from the women's side and not on the men's side, or vice versa, you're gonna have hell to pay when it comes to people looking at that and saying, wait a minute, that's not fair, that's inequitable. So let's be smart from the beginning. Let's figure out which way to do it so it's consistent, fair, and also in compliance with Title IX. Okay?
Next slide.
I think so, Dan.
Okay.
And I've got, there's like a million questions here. Yeah, why don't you flip, I'll look at that as well.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, geez, so many questions. All right, let me pop this back here for a second. All right, so we're going to move into the next section of this, which is really the cost containment and equitable treatment. I think I already sort of jumped into it. Sorry, Dan. but we're now going to look at, okay, we've talked about reduction in staff, coaching, and sports possibility. Now we're going to move into other cost containment opportunities, such as decreasing the number of games, eliminating trips that require flights, limiting conference play to divisional play, reducing travel squad sizes, and then we talked about this, reducing a little bit of the sports services. So just a general view of what we want to cover next. But before we dive into that, I'd like to kick it back to Dan and have him really go through from a Title IX lens again, what we're looking at in terms of equitable services. Dan?
Right. So as you're looking at trying to save money via decreased travel expenses or decreasing other cost centers, what does Title IX equitable treatment look like? Or on the other side, what cost containment measures might risk a violation of federal law, because you certainly don't want to be there. So while Cheryl's going to get into the details of it, I wanted to give you kind of the legal foundation. When we were talking about prong 1 and prong 2 and prong 3, that's equitable participation. That is one of 13 Title IX program areas. And here you see all 13 program areas, 11 of them relate to equitable treatment issues. At the end of the day, there's almost nothing that an athletic department does that does not fall into one of these 11 areas. You need to provide equitable treatment across the board in pretty much everything that you do. And so what makes this analytically difficult is that it's an aggregated analysis. You look at all of your men's teams, you look at all of your women's teams, and you look at them across all of these 11, what's sometimes called the laundry list areas, the equitable treatment areas, and you try to figure out, hey, at the midpoint, we acknowledge that, whatever, football players may be treated better than cross-country runners. We acknowledge that there are differences. And so in this aggregated analysis, the theory is that you try to find whatever your midpoint is. If football players get more and cross-country players, runners get less, what's the midpoint? You do the same thing on the women's side with the premier women's sports, with the women's sports that perhaps are receiving less. You find that midpoint and you try to figure out whether that median student athlete would willingly trade places, the men's median student athlete and the female median student athlete. That's extraordinarily difficult to do conceptually. And so what we often talk about in order to try to make this, to provide analytical diligence, to provide some kind of shorthand methods to try to figure out in bite-sized pieces, how do we provide equitable treatment? Because this aggregated analysis is just too broad to really conceptualize. We often talk about sports pairings, or we talk about sports strata. So a pairing, that just means, I would fully expect that every one of you, men's and women's cross country, are treated the same. And I would certainly hope that at all of your schools, men's and women's basketball are treated the same. But what comes up is, okay, there's football. Football and what? Where is your female offset, if you will, for when you don't have a pairing where it's men's and women's basketball and men's and women's cross country? And that's where we talk beyond the pairings, we start to talk about sports strata. So again, football and cross country don't need to be treated the same, but we need to figure out which sports are treated similarly to football. Is that strata balanced? which, if men's and women's cross country are in the same strata, what else falls in that strata? And is it balanced, both in terms of the quantity of student athletes who are receiving that equitable treatment, and is the treatment in fact equitable within that strata? Usually what we find is we're trying to do a legal conceptual offset for football, since there's not a women's football team, is we're often talking about women's soccer and women's volleyball. Is that equitable per se? Well, no, because you've got give or take 100 football players, and between women's soccer and volleyball, you've got give or take 45 female student athletes. So it's not entirely balanced, but at least we're moving in the right direction with a conceptual framework that you can apply equitably and consistently as you're thinking across your program. So this is what we call, Cheryl and I call the sports strata approach. We would recommend that you try to do that, because at the end of the day, it's going to help you if you're balanced across each of your various strata, that you will have your midpoint, your average treatment for male athletes, your average treatment for female athletes be much closer to equity, aggregate equity, which is the ultimate legal obligation. And so we hope that from a legal kind of framework, this is helpful for the ensuing discussion that Cheryl will now kick off with the specifics.
Okay, Dan, can you kick back to the other slide for a second, just for a minute? Thanks. Okay, so before I get into some of the ideas for cost cutting, when you look at this slide and look at the 11, we all call it the laundry list, 11 equitable treatment areas. Obviously, every one of these areas you all are looking at for possible reduction, cost saving, something here. So, and they're literally areas that are obviously, as you see, they're in Title IX. So every time you do this, it needs to be looked at through an equity lens. You cut on one side, you need to cut on the other, but know that it is in the aggregate. So if indeed you've got a travel situation that you need to maintain a charter flight for football, that you can have it justified, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to on the other side, if indeed you can justify it in terms of a extenuating circumstance, and Dan will get into that in a bit. But when you look at these 11 areas, so there are 3 things that you can look at for each of these. So let's take equipment and supplies, okay? When you're trying to look at it from an equity standpoint, 3 things, okay? Write these down. So you need to make sure that if you're doing equipment and supplies, that you look at the quality of the supplies between the men and women. You look at the amount of supplies between men and women, and you look at the availability of the supplies between the men and women's teams. And then if you have time, look at the maintenance of those supplies between men and women's teams. But if you look at it and break it down, so if you go into scheduling of the teams and practice sessions, if you're reducing there, you still cannot not review the fact that you're looking at when they're practicing, how often they're practicing, what facility they're practicing in. This is not a time where you can say we're in a crisis mode, so we can shift, this women's team over here and put the men's team over here, or vice versa. I've seen it where they've given the women the priority and the guys get shoved to the side. This is not the time to do this. Being in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic does not allow us to shortchange Title IX compliance, and more important, what's the right thing to do? I think we need to look at here. In terms of the travel and per diem, and that was one of the things on the next slide, thank you, Dan, that we're really looking at how we can systematically save money. And we know travel costs is a big area. And if we do it across the board from an equity standpoint, we are accomplishing our goals, reducing the money and reducing the budget, but ensuring equity and making sure that we still maintain a level of quality of competition for both the men and women's programs. So we're looking at decreasing the number of games. Many people I've talked to saying, Cheryl, we are crossing off any non-conference competition that we can, off the board, first thing. All we advise is make sure you're doing it from an equitable standpoint. Look at the total men's side, look at the total women's side, and make sure you're doing it in an equitable fashion. A lot of folks are saying we are now looking into, do we really need to fly everywhere? Can we, look at a couple more trips where we can bus? Can we eliminate some of those unneeded flights on both the men and women's side? Others are looking at limited conference plays. I talked to a number of commissioners over the last couple of days and saying, Cheryl, we are doing everything we can, up to and including, and one commissioner I talked to said, you know what, there are a couple championships that we don't actually need to have on a conference level because of the automatic qualifier if we do regular season. And they're looking at, do we need to do those championships to save money for the conference budgets? Because they're suffering as well. If they're used to getting a men's basketball revenue distribution, obviously they're looking at ways to cut as well. Decreasing travel squad size is another great way that you can reduce your costs. Again, be consistent with your plan, be consistent across the board. You drive the train, not your coaches, when it makes these decisions on what needs to be done. Do not fall into the trap of, oh man, I really need to have 3 extra players. I've got a couple of people that are injured. You need to be consistent with your plan of what you're going to do in terms of reducing travel squad sizes.
Right, and that's also where the strata comes in very handy, because if you're looking at decreasing the number of games, it's perfectly fine if you're decreasing, say, men's and women's cross-country opportunities. But if you find yourself in a position where you're not decreasing football opportunities, okay, well, let's make sure that we're providing equity on the other side. So that may mean perhaps that women's soccer has a full season, or volleyball has a full season. Because again, we need to be looking at equitable treatment, not across every single team, but definitely across paired teams or strata, similarly situated teams.
Exactly. Dan, I actually think I've covered the next slide as well, and I'm being very careful about time. The only thing here on this, I think I gave you some ideas on this particular area. I will tell you, a lot of folks are really looking into, when it comes to food, because we know that our athletes, we need to make sure that they're fueled properly, but they really are looking at more of a centralization of the food services as opposed to fueling stations now. So I just bring that up and some things that I've seen and talked to over the last couple of days. So we can move on.
Okay. So, it's important to note all of this stuff because obviously you are in these, very difficult budgetary situations. It is crucial that you reduce costs, no doubt. And really what we wanted to emphasize for you in this webinar today is to say that if you don't implement your changes equitably, you could step on a legal landmine, hence the title of our program. We mentioned some litigation examples before. We just wanted to reiterate that it is super easy for somebody to file a complaint at any time, whether it's in litigation, whether it's with the Office for Civil Rights. I wanted to give you a little bit of context here, just so you understand kind of how OCR operates. Again, they are statutorily required to investigate any complaint that they receive as long as it's well-founded. So rightfully, there has been a ton of attention over the last few years about Title IX sexual misconduct cases. But I wanted to give you the OCR statistics on Title IX athletics versus Title IX sexual misconduct cases. In 2017 and 2018, OCR received 1,745 complaints of sexual harassment and violence. That's terrible. But when it comes to athletics complaints, Title IX athletics complaints that OCR received in 2017, 2018, the number was more than double. There were 3,596 athletics-related complaints received by OCR in those years. So it is crucial that if you have questions about how do you provide equitable treatment as you're implementing cuts across the board, budgetary or otherwise, use your attorneys. Make sure that you are getting protection, that you are doing the best you can to comply with federal law as you're making these very difficult choices. So in the interest of time, I'll keep moving here. I guess, Cheryl, do you have anything else before we move into spring sport AFA?
No, I think we should cover that first, Dan, and then there's a lot of great questions, so we'll see if we can get to them. So let's continue forth.
Okay, so spring sport athletic financial aid, athletics-related financial aid, or scholarships. On March 30th, the Division I Council voted to allow schools to provide spring sports student athletes an additional season of competition and an extension of their period of eligibility in recognition of the fact that spring sports seasons were wiped out by this current pandemic. And so the NCAA limits on spring sports scholarships are waived for spring 2021 only. And baseball is the only sport that has a roster cap, but the 35-man roster for baseball is similarly waived by the NCAA. NCAA went farther and also clarified that the waivers with respect to AFA are only to cover returning seniors. And similarly, to the extent that financial aid can be varied next year, it can be decreased, that also applies only to returning seniors. So this truly can impact your Title IX compliance. We talked about prong one before. We all looked at the national numbers. Many of you are not reliant on prong one, and hopefully most of you will not have to face the prong one features because you're having to cut teams. So the reason that we're bringing this up here is actually it will impact every one of you when it comes to your scholarship compliance, right? If you have more baseball players coming back than softball players, or you have more women's lacrosse players coming back than men's lacrosse players next year, that conceivably could impact every one of you with respect to your athletic scholarship ratios. So what's the legal foundational issue? Well, under Title IX, so this is the last of the 13 program areas, number 1 being participation opportunities, 11 of them being equitable treatment or laundry list issues. Scholarship equity is the final and 13th area. And scholarship dollars must be awarded to women and men in the same proportion as their rates of participation. And generally that must be within 1% unless you can come up with a legitimate and non-discriminatory justification for a larger disparity. Is a pandemic a legitimate reason to have a variance? Absolutely it is. But what you need to understand, much like I said during the prong one sections, you've got to know what your numbers are ahead of time. Because like the NCAA is only going to excuse a variance beyond NCAA rules for returning spring sports seniors, I really think OCR or the courts would look at it similarly. You may have a legitimate justification for a narrow change, but I don't think that OCR or a court would excuse a prior existing disparity. So again, let's look at your self-reports, your EADA numbers that you reported, each of you reported to OCR last year. There were 656 NCAA reporting institutions with respect to scholarship compliance. We found that only 15.4% of all NCAA institutions, D1 and D2 institutions, actually complied with this 1% metric. Now, I didn't try to break it down beyond, how many schools were close one way or the other. But we did see that men were actually the underfunded gender nationwide, which is probably a surprising statistic for many people on this call. But men were underfunded beyond that 1% metric at 62.5% of all reporting NCAA schools. Now, this is not to say that there was, kind of the double-digit disparities that we're seeing on prong one. Frankly, there's not. The variances are not as wide when it comes to scholarship compliance. But all of this fuels the discussion, okay, as we've got spring sports seniors coming back, as we're making adjustments to try to afford their scholarships while cutting costs elsewhere, how is this impacting our legal compliance? So a lot of the discussion we've heard coming from schools is, well, teams can fundraise for it. We can't afford it. While we're cutting expenses elsewhere, we can't afford to just pay for spring sports scholarships. But if teams can successfully fundraise for it, awesome, we support you, do it. We want our student athletes back. We want their scholarship paid for. Other schools are saying, well, yeah, if you can fit more spring sport AFA, your returning senior AFA into your existing budgets, then go for it. But otherwise, we can't give you any more dollars. But take a step back and think about that in the context of your overall legal compliance with the scholarship metrics. What if baseball has more fundraising success than softball, and therefore more baseball players can get spring sport AFA next year? What if men's lacrosse has a bigger budget because it has a bigger roster, and therefore it is more conditioned or is in a better situation to absorb extra expenses from returning seniors to provide them scholarships? Those types of approaches where you're putting it onto the team instead of reining in your team and taking control as athletic administrators, those types of approaches create inequities. It is a formula for creating inequities where a softball player is not getting spring sport AFA or returning senior AFA because the softball team didn't have as much fundraising success. That is clearly an inequity. But what I wanted to point out here from a legal overlay standpoint is, it might not be a Title IX violation. Students will be aggrieved, but whether or not you're actually creating liability or exacerbating liability is a whole different question. So really the takeaway here is, as athletic administrators, number one, know your Title IX numbers, know where you stand, are you compliant, which is the overfunded gender? And then number two, you need to exercise oversight over these spring sport expenditures without putting it onto coaches to fundraise or to absorb into their existing budgets, without you understanding what impact that will have on your overall athletic department. So with that, let me turn it back over to Cheryl.
Dan, I thank you. And we've got, in terms of the summary of this, I think that you've given a lot of great information, that there's some incredible questions here that I think I'd like to have you answer real quick here, and then we can kind of close at the end here. Let me give you one, because what you brought up, and you just mentioned it, that, it's not always a yes or not always a no from OCR. So listen to this one. Our men's basketball team can play a Division I guarantee game, and it'll net 10 grand after the flight. Women's teams have no offers or none with no revenue. Are you recommending we don't play the men's game and lose the revenue when we have a chance to help the budget? I know your answer, but give it to us.
The answer is it depends. This is an aggregated analysis again, and that's difficult conceptually. I never want to encourage schools to leave money on the table, especially in a budgetary crisis. But what is your offset? So if men's basketball is getting one extra trip, where else can you provide an equitable offset? Maybe that does mean that the women's team gets to go to one destination trip, or if not women's basketball, perhaps volleyball already was planning to go on, some other trip. Where else can you find a balance? Where else can you find equity? That's how I would approach it analytically.
But, we both look at things like, we try not to have you give back any kind of money. Let's figure out a way. Let's look at, if there's a way to do that. So the answer is not, his answer is it depends, but it also is not a no. Did you hear that? Because it really does depend. And we look at any way we can to try to save a dollar anywhere we can. Okay, here's another good one. All right. If you flip-flop a full-time and a part-time position on two women's teams, can this present a Title IX issue? So here's what they're doing. They're flip-flopping in softball, their full-time head coach to part-time, but in women's basketball, they're flipping that from a part-time head coach to full-time. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
The net effect is that you're in the same position that you were before. So that move itself does not trouble me. But again, I would have to look at the overall where you stand. Are you providing opportunities equitably right now? Are the women's teams understaffed such that truly, to be equitable with your men's teams, both of them ought to be full-time coaches? I don't know. It's going to depend on a case-to-case basis. And just like Cheryl was saying a minute ago, these are the types of situations that we work through with schools all the time to try to help get you to yes, while also protecting you and making sure that you're not accidentally stepping into a legal problem.
And I always look at it, it's really hard when you're looking at those softball players to say, oh, by the way, your full-time coach is now a part-time coach. The whole morale issue of that's another one. It's not a Title IX issue, but it's a morale issue. Okay, Dan, here's another good one. All right. So what about if our plan was to add a women's sports team next year, which is part of the strategy to stay in prong 2 compliance, all right? And we postpone it until the following year because of this pandemic. Are we creating additional risks?
And this is a prong 2 school?
Yep. Well, it says our continuing strategy is to rely on prong 2. So they're adding sports. Okay.
Generally speaking, prong 2 has an expiration date on it. OCR doesn't really define what that expiration date is. Generally, I would use it as about 4 years, give or take. So if you're beyond a 4-year window, I think you may have 1 year of exposure. If you're within a 4-year window, then I would have no problem extending that timeline by 1 year given the pandemic. But what I would also want to try to factor in here is, again, so I'm an attorney for universities. If someone were to complain, what's the defense? What do you argue back? Well, you say, gosh, we're going to do it, but there's just a pandemic. So the way to mitigate that exposure is to add the team. Oh, wait, you are adding the team. I think that one's probably going to be okay, given the leeway that I would expect we'll have based on this pandemic. But I really would want to look at your overall situation to see, okay, when was the last team added? Are you safely within the prong 2 window? Do you need to be thinking about prong 3? Is prong 3 available to you right now? So there's more to it. That's not really a simple answer, but hopefully that's giving you a framework, a couple of ways that I would think through the question.
Really good questions. Hey, Dana, can you pop back on? Hey, Dana.
Hi.
Do we have time for one more question or do we need to wrap? I really
Yeah,
need to lean on you.
let's do one more question.
Okay, here's a good one. Oh, wait a minute, let me get it. All right, so hold on. Okay, our institution has instituted a hiring freeze and subsequently 2 assistant coaches have left. Is it considered inequitable not to fill those 2 assistant coaches for those sports because of the hiring freeze? Good question.
Yeah, you're in a tough spot there. I'm assuming for purposes of this question that it's not posed in the question, but I'm assuming that both coaches who left are on either coach teams of the same gender.
Yeah, it
So
doesn't say, but probably, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, meanwhile, your school has prohibited you from filling those spots. Yeah, I think that is a problem. And that's something that you're going to have to figure out whether or not you can work through it. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to disobey your school and hire, but look at what sort of staffing proposals you have on the other side. Are you furloughing equitably? Perhaps now you have to furlough more so on the other side to offset the missing coaches now, the missing positions that cannot be filled. Again, I'm just trying to kind of spitball right now with some creative solutions. It's always going to depend on what your circumstances are. We can get you to a situation where it's compliant pretty much every single one of these times, but you really need to be cognizant of where the legal landmines are to avoid them as you're making these difficult budgetary decisions.
You know, and I'll often, this is again the AD, we're talking here, and then Dana, I'll kick it back to you, but I've often been in that particular situation as well, and have gone to the president or to whomever and said, look, we need to be in compliant with Title IX. Can we get an exception for that freeze? Again, this is a tough time, guys, I get it, but I've had some success doing that too. So please be resourceful and explore all options here.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. I want to extend again our thanks from the NACTA office to both Dan and Cheryl for your time and your expertise today. I think it was obviously very well received. We had a full house. And to those of you who submitted questions, thank you. We had a ton of questions coming through. So for those that we didn't get to in the live presentation, we have your information. We'll be reaching out to you after the session is over. And then as a reminder, we will be supplying the archived recording of this session to all registrants and via the NACTA Daily Review as well. So we hope to see you online again soon, and thanks for your attendance.
Thanks, everyone. Be safe.